Our troops are back. We're talking FF7. We're talking Rebirth. We have a kind of interesting thing to talk about today. I definitely want to discuss this. There's been like articles and reports being shared around about the sales drop for Rebirth in Japan, and it's a massive drop-off. But what's important that some people are leaving out when discussing this is that what we're looking at is the physical sales of the game. Though it still is a massive drop-off, it isn't the overall story. Initially, we had a sales report coming out from Famitsu that was translated by Insider Gaming, and then the Gamer reported on the Insider Gaming article, and I think the Gamer article is the one that I've seen the most kind of making the rounds. So Insider Gaming says, according to the latest sales report from Famitsu, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth sales in Japan fell to 24,482 copies for the week of March 4th to March 10th. The game's total sales now sit at 287,138 in its second week after release. It previously held first place, selling 262,656 copies throughout its launch week. So again, this is at retail, right? These are physical copies, but it's still a pretty drastic drop. So the first week, the launch week of Rebirth, they dropped like 200,000 copies in Japan. And then the second week, they only sell 20,000. So it's like a 90% decrease. It's physical copies, but that's still a massive drop-off. Also, I've seen from another article covering this that first week of Rebirth sold less in Japan than what Final Fantasy 16 did, which is kind of interesting. Now, there's kind of a lot of factors that go into really both of these. In terms of like the 16 comparison, even though you have the popularity of FF7 itself, 16 kind of appeals to like a wider audience in terms of just the game itself, like with the gameplay, kind of leaning more into the action, the sort of Soulsborne model. But also it being an M-rated game, that's going to appeal to a lot of people, even though they think that like T-rated games are going to sell more, when they probably do to a certain degree. Having an M-rated Final Fantasy is one of the reasons that I bought it. I was probably going to buy it anyways just because I am a Final Fantasy fan, but I was really looking forward to experiencing an M-rated Final Fantasy. We've had them before with Stranger Paradise and like Type 0 and shit like that, but getting an actual numbered entry that's M-rated, I was excited for, man. In terms of just the Rebirth itself, I mean, there's a lot of factors that are working against it, even though I do think it is a lot better than Remake. For once, a sequel. Like, it's not super often, unless like the first game's an absolute hit, that a sequel's going to outsell it. Something with like movies, right? Like it depends on how successful the first movie is. If it's overly successful, the second one might outsell it or do better at the box office, that sort of thing. But it's also just what we've been saying for the longest time here with the Remake project. There's just so many factors that work against it. The episodic nature of the releases, there's people who think that that's what's happening, which it's not. These are full fucking games. If you've played Rebirth, you know. Like, it took me, almost 2 weeks to beat the goddamn game? It's massive, dude. We're not releasing the FF7 story in episodes, right? These are full-fledged games. Even Remake by itself, if you're trying to do everything, is like an 80-ish hour game, dude. Like, there's so much to these games. They're not episodes. Episodic games are like way smaller. They're just significantly smaller than what these games are. And there's obviously like years and years in between these releases. There's massive development that goes into making these games. Whatever, we've been talking about this forever. So the gameplay, this kind of goes back to like the OG fans that are bitching about the episodic release. You have the gameplay, which is more action RPG and everything like that. And the turn-based players are just simply not going to buy it or not enjoy it. Or maybe they played Remake and didn't like it. They're not going to buy the sequel, that sort of thing. And of course, when it comes to the Remake project itself, you have the potential of new stuff, right? And we're not going to go into like anything that happens in Rebirth, but obviously with the Remake project, they're trying to, whether anything's going to be different or not, they're trying to make the players think that. With Remake, with Rebirth, and then obviously with the third game, we'll eventually get answers. But it looks like on paper, for like the general audience out there who maybe are casual fans and played like FF7 growing up or whatever, want to get into the Remake project, they watch the trailers, they watch some gameplay, and they're like, what the fuck is this? What are these space ghost things? These goddamn Dementors or whatever, right? Like shit like that, it's going to push a lot of like casual fans away. And even if they did check out Remake, they might not like the ending and they're never going to play Rebirth. I said this a lot on the channel, and this is my personal opinion. I want new shit. I welcome new shit. I want this to be like a follow-up to the compilation. I want this to be a sequel if it can be, that whole thing. Even if none of that's true, that's what I want. Because we have FF7 OG, and I love the game. I can play that anytime I want to. It's on my PS4, PS5. I can play FF7 OG anytime I want to. I don't mind a modern interpretation, a retelling or whatever. Reimagining, I think is what they called it. But I would love there to be a continuation of the compilation, like, because there's more to be told, right? We've had cliffhangers and shit with like stuff like Dirge of Cerberus or whatever. So I want there to be more. Me personally. Again, there's a lot of factors that are working against Rebirth, right? Remake itself, the first game in the trilogy, was already quite polarizing. It rated high, obviously, but in terms of like the general audience like reception, it was just a bit polarizing, from gameplay to potential new story elements, the episodic release, and et cetera, et cetera. So it's just always going to be a little bit detrimental to Rebirth. But again, we're just looking at the physical copies in Japan. The digital might be perfectly fine, and it might have done really, really good elsewhere. At least according to the Gamers article on this, they say that this is pretty standard for a PS5 exclusive in Japan, because something like the Nintendo Switch is just so massive over there, right? So there's just like a low adoption rate for, I guess, PS5 exclusives. They further went on to say it's not necessarily common to have such a drastic drop-off, like a 90% drop-off rate in the second week. That is particularly interesting. I'm kind of curious overall what the sales are going to be for Rebirth and how it stacks up to Remake. I tried to see if I could find like what the physical sales of Remake were in the first week in Japan. I couldn't necessarily track that down. I'd like to see the comparison there of just to see how it stacks up to Rebirth, but also like if there was any kind of like drastic drop-off the second week when it came to Remake in terms of physical sales. Also very curious how to stack up to Remake in terms of like the long-run sales, because with Remake, they were very, very vague with the cells. We had updates a few times throughout like the first year or so of the game, and then it was kind of nothing until last year, like 2023, I think September 2023. We finally had an update that like Remake had sold 7 million copies, and I don't know if that's like the PS4 version and PS5 version or any combination of that or whatever, or one of those, but it only was 7 million, which is, I think it's still successful, and it was probably a financially successful game. I think for some people out there, at least for me personally, that feels like a little bit underperforming. I mean, you're selling millions of copies of a game, so it's still successful. But just given the popularity of the original FF7, you would think they would potentially sell more. But again, there's a lot of factors working against the Remake project. And I think to a certain degree, like Square Enix probably feels like it underperformed too, because for one, they weren't touting the sales of the game as the years were going on. They were very quiet for a couple of years. But also, like, we only hit like 7 million global sales as of September 2023. We hit half that in the first weekend. Like the opening weekend of Remake, it hit 3.5 million sales. And then it took all this time to only double that. The point of bringing that up is that like Remake wasn't this like massive, massive success. That you see some exclusives, some PlayStation exclusives hit like 10 million sales, 20 million sales, right? That just didn't happen with Remake. So Rebirth is probably, I'd be surprised if Rebirth outsold it. That's the thing. And you also had, we're looking at 7 million sales. Again, if that's factoring in PS4, PS5, Rebirth is only on the PS5, right? There's only one platform to sell that game on. The initial install base of Remake was on the PS4, which had 100+ million, like, you know, PS4s out in the world or whatever the fuck. So, like, you know, Rebirth is going to have, like, a lower install base, and it is only one platform now, and so on and so forth. There's just a lot of things that are going to work against Rebirth, that whether that's fair or not. Like, kind of the whole point of this video is I want to clarify, for one, what people are looking at here in terms of, like, obviously, Rebirth didn't just sell 200,000 copies in Japan, like total. It's physical copies. That's very, very important, which means the digital was probably significantly higher, I would think, just in Japan alone. But also that like there's a lot of reasons why Rebirth might underperform compared to Remake, as we talked about throughout this video, obviously. I will say though, they haven't touted the sales yet for Rebirth, which is kind of interesting because with Remake they were doing it, I think around like 10 or 11 days after release. There's an article in like Square Enix about the 3.5 million sales, and mentioned that was like the first couple of days of the opening weekend or whatever. We haven't seen that yet, and we're, you know, more than 2 weeks out from Rebirth releasing. We haven't got that, you know, 3.5 million sales or nothing. Like, we haven't seen nothing about the sales of the game, which makes you think that it might be underperforming to a certain degree. But what we'll have in the next like coming weeks or maybe month or two, we'll have a financial report come out at some point that'll give us an idea of how much money Rebirth has made. Like, then we can stack that up against what Remake made and the sales of Remake and all that other shit. Anyways, this is going to be the video, my dudes. Let's pass off to you guys. What are your thoughts? What do you think Rebirth's going to do? How do you think it's going to sell? Is it doing better like in the West than it is in like Japan or whatever? How do you think it's going to stack up against Remake? Do you think it's going to, in the long run, perform better? On paper, it should, just because it's a significantly better game. I think it appeals to a wider audience for sure than what Remake did. I think it should be more successful than Remake, but I don't know that it will be. Anyways, that's the video. Subscribe to the channel if you guys are new, in the description below. Follow me on Twitter, @davidYT. That's it. Bye.
Used to care what people thought, but now I care more, and nobody out here's got it figured out. So therefore, I've lost all hope of a happy ending, depending on whether or not it's worth it. So insecure, no one's perfect. We spend it with no shame. We blow that like Coltrane. We in here like Rogaine, or leave it like Cobain.